In the sterile halls of the Galactic Medical Academy, where alien students from 100 peaceful worlds learn to heal with precision instruments and advanced technology, nobody expected the human exchange student to arrive with nothing but a worn leather satchel and scars covering his hands. Dr. Marcus Chen had survived 18 months on Kepler 442c, a planet so hostile that the Galactic Council classified it as uninhabitable for sentient life. He had treated radiation poisoning with tree bark, performed surgery with sharpened metal scraps, and kept people alive when every piece of advanced medical equipment had failed or been destroyed. Now, as he stands before a classroom of beings who have never known true desperation, who have never had to choose between saving one life or three, who have never held a dying patient together with nothing but determination and improvised tools, they are about to learn that sometimes the most advanced medicine in the universe isn't found in a textbook. It's found in the stubborn refusal of a human to let death win. What happens when a species that evolved on a Deathworld teaches the galaxy's elite medical students that the most powerful tool in medicine isn't technology, it's the unbreakable will to survive? The morning air in the Galactic Medical Academy carried the usual mixture of antiseptic and nervous energy, but today something felt different. Dr. Vexai, the Ultrurian department head, noticed it immediately as her 4 eyes scanned the assembled students in Lecture Hall 7. The excitement was almost tangible, rippling through the diverse crowd of beings who represented the finest medical minds from across the galaxy. Today marks a significant moment in our institution's history, Dr. Vexai began, her crystalline voice carrying easily through the amphitheater. For the first time, we welcome an exchange student from Earth, a planet that has only recently joined our galactic community. A murmur spread through the audience. Earth was still something of a curiosity to most galactic citizens. The humans had appeared seemingly overnight in cosmic terms, having achieved faster-than-light travel through methods that made established physicists question fundamental assumptions about space-time manipulation. But it wasn't their technology that made them interesting, it was their origin. Earth was classified as a Class 7 Deathworld, a designation reserved for planets so hostile to life that the Galactic Council had initially assumed no intelligent species could possibly evolve there. The fact that humans had not only survived but thrived on such a world had sent ripples of fascination and concern throughout galactic civilization. Xanthilla, a delicate Vesperan student with gossamer wings and compound eyes, leaned toward her study partner, Querx. "I heard Earth has active volcanism on nearly every continent," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her species' natural harmonic undertones. Querx, whose gelatinous form quivered with nervous energy, responded with a series of bioluminescent flashes that translated roughly to disbelief. His homeworld of Serenitia had achieved perfect environmental balance 3 million years ago. The concept of living with constant geological instability was almost incomprehensible. Additionally, Querx pulsed in worried patterns. "I accessed the Earth atmospheric data. They breathe a gas mixture that would be toxic to most carbon-based life forms. Oxygen at those concentrations should cause rapid cellular degradation." Near the back of the hall, Takora adjusted her position on the specialized sitting apparatus designed for her centaurid body structure. As a Kanthari, she came from a world where medical emergencies were virtually unknown. Their society had eliminated disease, injury, and even natural death through careful genetic management and environmental control. The idea of practicing medicine under primitive conditions seemed not just challenging, but pointlessly dangerous. "Perhaps this is some form of cultural exchange," Takora mused to herself, her redundant heart systems pumping curious biochemicals through her azure blood. "Surely they cannot expect us to learn anything practical from a species that has only recently discovered antimatter synthesis." Dr. Vexai's announcement continued, but her tone carried a note that made several students refocus their attention. "Dr. Marcus Chen brings unique experience to our program. He has spent the last 18 months providing medical care on Kepler 442c during the mining colony crisis." The silence that followed this statement was profound. Every being in the hall knew about Kepler 442, though most tried not to think about it. The planet existed at the absolute edge of what the Galactic Council considered marginally habitable for emergency resource extraction. The mining operation there had been a desperate attempt to secure rare elements needed for faster-than-light drive construction, but it had gone catastrophically wrong when solar flare activity had destroyed most of their technological infrastructure. What followed had been 18 months of the kind of survival scenario that most civilized species had nightmares about. Cut off from galactic civilization, with failing life support systems and no way to evacuate. The mixed species colony had faced extinction. Most galactic medical professionals had assumed that anyone trapped on Kepler 442c was effectively dead. The planet's hostile environment, combined with the complete failure of modern medical technology, should have made survival impossible. Yet somehow, a human doctor had kept people alive. The main doors of the lecture hall opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Dr. Marcus Chen walked in. The assembled students had been expecting someone extraordinary, perhaps bearing obvious signs of advanced genetic modification or cybernetic enhancement that might explain his reported survival on a Deathworld. Instead, they saw a man who looked unremarkably human by the standards they had studied in xenobiology classes. Marcus Chen appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair showing premature grey streaks and skin that bore the kind of weathering that came from extended exposure to harsh environments. He was neither particularly tall nor imposing by human standards, and he carried himself with the careful, economical movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy. What immediately drew attention, however, were his hands. His hands were covered in a complex network of scars, thin white lines that crisscrossed his fingers and palms, small circular marks that suggested burns, and the kind of calloused, permanently stained skin that spoke of constant contact with harsh chemicals and abrasive materials. Most striking were several fingers that had been broken and healed improperly, leaving them slightly crooked but apparently still functional. Xenthia's compound eyes focused with difficulty on the human's damaged appendages. In her species' medical tradition, hands were considered sacred, the primary tools for healing touch and energy manipulation. The idea that a medical professional would allow his hands to become so damaged was deeply disturbing. Marcus carried only a worn leather satchel that looked like it had been repaired multiple times with different materials. Unlike the sleek, standardized medical kits that every student carried, containing sterilization fields, molecular scanners, and precise surgical instruments crafted from exotic alloys, his bag appeared to be handmade and bulged with irregular shapes that defied easy categorization. Dr. Chen. Dr. Vexai gestured toward the podium with two of her forearms. Perhaps you would share some insights about practicing medicine under challenging conditions. Marcus nodded and approached the speaking platform, but he didn't immediately begin talking. Instead, he set his battered satchel on the demonstration table and began removing items from it. The students watched with growing confusion as he arranged what appeared to be a collection of primitive tools and unidentifiable organic materials. There was a metal instrument that looked like it had been hand-forged from scrap material, its edges carefully sharpened but obviously created without precision machinery. Several small glass containers held plant matter in various states of preparation, dried leaves, processed roots, and what appeared to be crude extracts suspended in alcohol solutions. A collection of needles in different sizes had been sterilized and wrapped in clean cloth, but they were clearly repurposed from non-medical applications. 18 months ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying the kind of steady calm that came from experience with genuine crisis. I was part of the emergency medical team dispatched to Kepler 442c when the mining operation lost communication with the Colonial Health Authority. We expected to find infrastructure damage and maybe some radiation exposure cases. He picked up one of the glass containers, holding it so the students could see the dark liquid inside. Instead, we found a colony of 437 beings from 12 different species, trapped on a planet that was actively trying to kill them, with life support systems failing and every piece of advanced medical equipment either destroyed or non-functional. Takora's redundant hearts began beating in an irregular pattern that her species associated with anxiety. "Surely," she interrupted, her melodious voice carrying the harmonics of polite concern, the appropriate response would have been immediate evacuation. Practicing medicine without proper equipment and environmental controls would be inadvisable. Marcus turned toward her, and for a moment, his expression showed something that the students would later realize was a very human mixture of patience and profound sadness. Evacuation would have been ideal, he agreed. Unfortunately, the solar flare activity that destroyed the colony's communication and transport systems also made faster-than-light travel impossible in that system for approximately 18 months. The electromagnetic interference from the stellar phenomenon created a dead zone that our ships couldn't penetrate. He set down the container and picked up the hand-forged metal instrument. So the choice became very simple. Find a way to keep people alive using whatever was available, or watch them die while waiting for rescue. The weight of this statement settled over the lecture hall like a physical presence. Most of the students came from species and worlds where such extreme choices were literally inconceivable. The infrastructure of galactic civilization was designed with multiple redundancies specifically to prevent scenarios where survival came down to individual improvisation and determination. Querix's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that indicated deep philosophical confusion. His species had evolved in harmony with their environment for millions of years, developing biological solutions to medical problems that were elegant, efficient, and utterly dependent on the specific conditions of their homeworld. The concept of medicine as a desperate struggle against hostile circumstances was alien to his entire conceptual framework. The first challenge, Marcus continued, was understanding that everything I had been trained to do was based on assumptions that no longer applied. Sterile environments, precise dosages calculated by quantum computers, surgical instruments crafted from materials that cost more than most planets' annual budgets, none of that was available. He gestured to his scarred hands. These came from learning that sometimes you have to improvise surgical instruments from whatever metal you can find, and that sterilizing them properly requires techniques that most medical schools don't teach anymore because they've been obsolete for centuries. Dr. Vexhai observed her students' reactions with growing interest. She had arranged for Dr. Chen's visit partly out of academic curiosity, but also because she had begun to suspect that the galactic medical establishment had become perhaps too dependent on technological solutions. Watching her students struggle to comprehend the concepts Marcus was describing, she realized that her suspicions might be well-founded. Perhaps, suggested a student from the back of the hall, a tall, ethereal being whose species was known for their logical approach to problem-solving, you could demonstrate some of these alternative techniques? Marcus smiled, and it was the first time his expression had shown genuine warmth. Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. Dr. Wopley. Vexe has arranged for a series of practical exercises that will simulate some of the conditions we faced on Kepler 442c. You're going to learn medicine the way my species had to learn it for most of our history. When the technology fails, when the environment is hostile, and when the only thing standing between your patient and death is your knowledge, your determination, and your willingness to improvise. The silence that followed this announcement was broken by Zenthila's whispered question. But what if someone gets hurt during these exercises? Marcus looked at her directly, and his scarred hands moved to reorganize the primitive tools on the table.
That's exactly the right question, he said.
Because on a death world, that's always the first consideration. Every action you take, every treatment you attempt, every improvised solution you create, has to account for the possibility that you might make things worse instead of better. The difference between life and death often comes down to making the best possible decision with incomplete information, under impossible conditions, while accepting that failure means someone doesn't go home to their family. He picked up the leather satchel and held it so the students could see the careful repairs that held it together. This bag survived 18 months on Kepler 442c because I learned to fix it when it broke, to reinforce it when it weakened, and to adapt it when conditions changed. By the end of our time there, it looked nothing like the standard medical kit I'd brought from Earth. But it kept the tools I needed safe and accessible, and that meant I could keep doing my job. Marcus set the bag down and looked around the lecture hall, meeting the eyes of students whose expressions ranged from fascination to horror to complete bewilderment. Over the next several sessions, you're going to learn that medicine, at its core, isn't about the tools or the technology, or even the theoretical knowledge. It's about refusing to give up on the life in front of you, no matter how impossible the situation seems. You're going to discover that sometimes the most advanced treatment in the universe is the willingness to try something that shouldn't work, because all the things that should work have already failed. The implications of this statement rippled through the assembled students like a wave. Most had chosen medicine because it represented the pinnacle of their species' technological and intellectual achievements, precise, predictable, and safe. The idea that effective medical practice might require abandoning those certainties and embracing desperate improvisation challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of healing itself. Tomorrow, Dr. Vexhai announced, we will begin practical exercises in a specially prepared environment that simulates some of the challenges Dr. Chen faced. Students should prepare mentally for approaches to medical practice that may differ significantly from standard protocols. As the lecture ended and students began filing out of the hall, conversations erupted in dozens of languages and communication methods. The excitement that had filled the room at the beginning of the session had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and the dawning realization that they were about to be challenged in ways their education had never prepared them for. Marcus began packing his primitive tools back into the scarred leather satchel, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to treat every piece of equipment as irreplaceable. Dr. Vexay approached him as the last students disappeared through the exit doors. "Your presentation was enlightening," she said, her four eyes showing the kind of focused attention that indicated deep thought. "I confess I had not fully considered the implications of what you survived on Kepler 442.
2.
The reports mentioned that you kept colonists alive, but they did not convey the philosophical challenges that such survival would entail." Marcus looked up from his packing, one of the glass containers still in his damaged hands. "Most of the reports focused on the medical outcomes," he said. "How many lives were saved, what injuries were successfully treated, which diseases we managed to prevent or cure. But the real story isn't in the statistics. It's in learning that sometimes you have to choose between saving one person for certain and trying to save 3 people with a much lower chance of success. It's in discovering that the difference between medicine and miracles is often just refusing to accept that someone is going to die." He held up the container so she could see the dark liquid inside. "This is an extract from a plant that shouldn't exist. It grows in soil contaminated with heavy metals and radiation that would kill most organic life. But somehow, it not only survives, it produces compounds that help other organisms process toxins. I spent 2 months figuring out how to prepare it safely, testing it on myself first because I couldn't risk anyone else's life on an untested treatment." Dr. Vexhai's crystalline features showed the kind of expression her species reserved for moments of genuine revelation. "You experimented on yourself? When you're the only medical professional available and people are dying from radiation poisoning and you think you might have found a treatment but you can't be certain it's safe." Marcus shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both humility and the weight of impossible decisions. "Someone has to be first. Someone has to take the risk. And if you're asking other people to trust you with their lives, you better be willing to trust yourself with your own." As they walked toward the exit, Dr. Rule Vexay found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the practice of medicine. Her species had mastered healing arts millions of years ago, creating systems so refined and reliable that medical emergencies were virtually unknown. But listening to Marcus describe medicine as a constant struggle against impossible odds, where success was measured not in perfection but in the willingness to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless, she began to wonder if perhaps they had lost something essential along the way. The next morning would bring practical exercises that would challenge everything the students thought they knew about medical practice. But already, just from one lecture, seeds had been planted that would grow into a fundamental transformation in how the galaxy's finest medical minds understood the art of healing. In the quiet corridors of the Galactic Medical Academy, where every surface was sterile and every system was optimized for perfect efficiency, the echo of Marcus Chen's words lingered like a promise of revelations yet to come. The practical training facility had been transformed overnight into something that looked more like a disaster zone than a medical classroom. Where yesterday there had been pristine white walls, organized equipment stations, and the gentle hum of climate control systems, now there were makeshift barriers created from salvaged materials, flickering emergency lighting that cast uneven shadows, and the sound of machinery operating just barely within acceptable parameters. Dr. Vexay had worked with the Academy's environmental systems team to create what they were calling controlled chaos, a learning environment that simulated the kind of conditions Marcus had faced on Kepler 442c without actually putting students in genuine danger. The result was unsettling enough that several students had needed to take anxiety medications before entering the space. "The first thing you learn when everything goes wrong," Marcus announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying easily over the ambient noise of failing systems, "is that your training is both more valuable and more useless than you ever imagined." He stood next to a table that held what appeared to be a standard trauma victim simulation android, but one that had been deliberately damaged and modified to represent the kind of injuries they might encounter in a real crisis. Instead of the seamless, pristine training models the students were accustomed to, this android bore the marks of realistic damage, burn patterns that spoke of electrical fires, radiation exposure indicators that glowed ominously in the dim lighting, and injury simulations that didn't follow the neat, textbook patterns of academic exercises. More valuable, Marcus continued, because the fundamental principles of anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry don't change just because your equipment fails. A blocked airway will still kill your patient whether you're in the finest hospital in the galaxy or trapped in a cave. More useless because everything you've been taught about how to solve medical problems assumes access to tools and resources that might not exist when you need them most. Xanthilla approached the simulation android, with her characteristic caution, her compound eyes trying to process the unfamiliar injury patterns. On her homeworld, medical emergencies followed predictable patterns. Environmental hazards were minimized, dangerous activities were carefully regulated, and the most serious trauma cases were usually the result of rare accidents that had been thoroughly studied and prepared for. The random, chaotic damage represented by the android was disturbing in its unpredictability. "The burn patterns," she observed, her harmonic voice carrying undertones of confusion. "They don't follow standard electrical injury protocols. The tissue damage extends in directions that shouldn't be possible with normal current flow." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Excellent observation. On Kepler 442c, we discovered that the planet's magnetic field anomalies could create electrical discharges that behaved in ways that don't match standard physics models. The burns you're looking at are based on actual injuries I treated. Electricity that somehow jumped through supposedly non-conductive materials and caused damage that defied everything I thought I knew about electrical trauma." He moved to stand beside the android, his scarred hands gesturing to different areas of simulated damage. "So the question becomes, do you stick to established treatment protocols that assume normal electrical behavior, or do you adapt your approach based on what you're actually seeing, even if it contradicts your training?" Takora's redundant heart systems began pumping stress biochemicals as she contemplated the implications of this question. Her species' medical tradition was built on millions of years of careful observation and gradual refinement. They had eliminated medical uncertainty through exhaustive study and perfect environmental control. The idea of making treatment decisions based on incomplete information that contradicted established knowledge challenged the core principles of Kanthari medical philosophy. "Surely," Takora said, her melodious voice carrying harmonics of polite disagreement, "the appropriate response would be to gather more information before attempting treatment. Without proper diagnostic equipment, how can one be certain of the underlying pathophysiology?" Marcus picked up one of his improvised tools, a metal probe that had been hand-forged from scrap material and carefully sharpened to serve multiple purposes. "Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right. Proper diagnosis is the foundation of effective treatment. But what happens when your diagnostic equipment has been destroyed, your power systems are failing, and your patient is dying while you're trying to figure out exactly what's wrong?" He demonstrated by using the improvised probe to examine the android's simulated injuries, his movements careful but confident despite the tool's primitive appearance.
On Kepler
442. "See, I had to learn to make treatment decisions based on incomplete information, because waiting for complete information meant watching people die. Sometimes the choice isn't between a perfect solution and an imperfect one. It's between doing something that might work and doing nothing while someone bleeds out in front of you." Crex's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that indicated deep philosophical distress. His species had evolved medical practices that were elegant biological solutions to biological problems. They grew specialized organisms to serve as living medical instruments, cultivated symbiotic relationships with healing microbes, and treated disease as an imbalance in natural harmony rather than a problem to be solved through technological intervention. The concept of medicine as violent action against time and circumstance was alien to everything he understood about the healing arts. "Perhaps," Querex pulsed in patterns of cautious inquiry, "there are alternative approaches that would be less aggressive? On Serenita, we believe that healing comes from understanding and working with natural processes rather than fighting against them." Marcus set down the improvised probe and looked at Querex with an expression that conveyed both respect and profound sadness. "That's a beautiful philosophy," he said. "And under normal circumstances, it's probably superior to human approaches in every way. But what happens when natural processes have been disrupted by radiation levels that prevent normal cellular repair? What do you do when the patient's natural healing abilities have been compromised by toxins that don't exist in any normal environment?" He gestured to another section of the android that simulated radiation poisoning symptoms. "This represents a colonist I treated who had been exposed to exotic particles created when the planet's magnetic field interacted with solar flare activity. The radiation was unlike anything in our databases. It was causing cellular damage that followed patterns we had never seen before. Every natural healing process in his body was working against him, because his biology didn't know how to respond to this particular type of injury." Marcus picked up one of his glass containers, holding it so the students could see the dark plant extract inside. "So I had to find an unnatural solution. This extract comes from plants that had somehow adapted to grow in contaminated soil. By studying how they processed the toxic elements, I was able to develop a treatment that helped his cells survive long enough for his natural healing to take over." But it required me to do things to his biochemistry that no textbook would ever recommend, because no textbook had ever contemplated this particular combination of circumstances. The weight of this explanation settled over the students like a physical presence. Most had been raised in civilizations where medical practice was predictable, where diseases followed known patterns, and where treatments had been refined over millennia to achieve consistent, reliable results. The idea that effective medicine might sometimes require abandoning established wisdom and improvising solutions to unprecedented problems challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of knowledge itself. Dr. Vexhai, who had been observing from the edge of the training area, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should begin with a practical exercise," she suggested. Dr. Chen has prepared a scenario that will allow you to experience some of these decision-making challenges firsthand. Marcus nodded and began setting up what appeared to be a complex trauma simulation, but one that deliberately incorporated elements designed to frustrate normal diagnostic and treatment protocols. The android was programmed to present symptoms that didn't quite match standard categories. Equipment malfunctions were built into the scenario, and environmental factors would gradually degrade throughout the exercise.
You'll be working in teams of 3, Marcus explained.
Each team gets one patient, and each patient presents a different combination of problems. But here's the critical element. Your standard diagnostic equipment will fail at random intervals. Your treatment options will be limited to whatever supplies I've provided, and the environmental conditions will change throughout the exercise in ways that require constant adaptation. He gestured to a collection of supplies that looked like the contents of his leather satchel, expanded and distributed across several workstations. Instead of the familiar precision instruments and standardized medications the students were accustomed to, each station contained improvised tools, plant-based preparations, and equipment that appeared to have been repaired multiple times with whatever materials were available. The goal isn't to achieve perfect medical outcomes, Marcus continued. The goal is to learn how to make the best possible decisions with imperfect information, limited resources, and no guarantee that your chosen approach will work. You're going to discover what it means to practice medicine when the only thing you can control is your own determination not to give up. Zenthilla found herself partnered with a carer, an Anexian student named Vorthikar, whose crystalline body structure made him an expert in bioenergetic healing techniques. Their patient android presented what appeared to be a combination of radiation exposure, trauma injuries, and some kind of systemic toxicity that didn't match any known poison profiles. "The first challenge," Zenthilla observed, "is that our standard radiation exposure protocols assume access to cellular regeneration chambers and quantum-level toxin extraction.
Without those resources, we have to find another way." Takora finished, her harmonics showing reluctant acceptance of the situation.
But how do we determine proper treatment dosages without molecular-level analysis? How do we monitor cellular response without quantum sensors? Vortak's crystalline form resonated with frequencies that indicated deep contemplation. "Perhaps," he suggested, "the answer lies not in replacing our missing technology, but in developing new methods that work with available resources." Dr. Chen mentioned learning to observe biological processes directly, rather than through instrumental mediation. They began examining their patient more carefully, and gradually realized that Marcus had embedded clues throughout the android's presentation. Subtle indicators that could be detected through direct observation if they knew what to look for. The progression of simulated symptoms followed patterns that, while unfamiliar, were internally consistent and potentially treatable if approached with sufficient creativity and willingness to experiment. At the next workstation, Quirks was working with 2 students from species that had developed entirely different approaches to medical practice. Their patient presented injuries that seemed to be getting worse despite their initial treatment attempts, forcing them to constantly reevaluate their understanding of the situation. The traditional Serenitian approach, Quirks pulsed in frustrated patterns, would be to establish biological harmony through symbiotic intervention. But these injury patterns suggest an active disruption of natural cellular processes that resists harmonization. His partners were experiencing similar frustrations with their own traditional methods. Nothing they had been trained to do seemed adequate to address the complex, chaotic damage patterns they were encountering. They found themselves forced to improvise, combining techniques from different medical traditions in ways that felt fundamentally wrong according to their individual training, but somehow seemed to work when applied to this unprecedented situation. As the exercise progressed, Marcus moved between the workstations, offering guidance that consistently pushed the students away from familiar approaches and towards solutions that required genuine problem-solving rather than the application of memorized procedures. His advice was always practical rather than theoretical, focused on what could be done with available resources, rather than what should be done under ideal circumstances. Stop thinking about what you wish you had, he told one struggling team, and start thinking about what you can do with what's actually in front of you. That plant extract might not be in your pharmacology database, but if it's reducing inflammation in your patient's tissue, maybe it's worth trying to understand why instead of dismissing it because it's not standardized. The most revealing moment came when several teams encountered equipment failures that left them with no technological support for critical procedures. The android patients were programmed to deteriorate rapidly without intervention, forcing the students to choose between abandoning established safety protocols and watching their simulated patients die. Xanthilla found herself holding an improvised surgical instrument, a piece of metal that Marcus had shaped and sterilized, but which bore no resemblance to the precision tools she was accustomed to using. Her patient was experiencing internal bleeding that would be fatal without immediate surgery, but attempting the procedure with such primitive equipment violated everything she had been taught about sterile technique and surgical precision. "I can't," she said, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of genuine distress. The risk of additional trauma, the possibility of introducing infection, the lack of precision control, everything about this violates fundamental surgical principles. Tokora's redundant hearts were pumping stress chemicals that made it difficult for her to think clearly. Perhaps we should wait for the equipment to be repaired? Surely attempting surgery under these conditions would cause more harm than benefit. But as they hesitated, their patient's vital signs continued deteriorating. The android was programmed to simulate the progression of internal bleeding with realistic precision, and it was becoming clear that waiting was not an option. Marcus appeared at their workstation, but instead of offering direct guidance, he asked a simple question. What happens if you do nothing? The answer was obvious. Their patient would die. But the implications of that answer forced them to confront a fundamental truth about medical practice that their advanced training had never prepared them for. Sometimes the choice isn't between safe and dangerous, but between dangerous and fatal. Xanthilla looked at the improvised surgical tool in her hands, then at her simulated patient's deteriorating condition. Everything in her training screamed that what she was contemplating was reckless and irresponsible. But everything in her deeper understanding of medicine, the calling that had led her to choose healing as her life's work, told her that letting someone die when she might be able to save them was worse than any violation of standard protocols. She began the surgery. The procedure was unlike anything she had ever attempted. Without precision instruments, she had to rely on tactile feedback and visual observation to guide her movements. Without real-time monitoring, she had to judge her patient's condition based on subtle indicators that she had learned to recognize in theory but had never needed to use in practice. Without the safety net of technological backup systems, every decision carried the weight of irreversible consequences. But as she worked, something remarkable happened. Stripped of her familiar tools and forced to rely on fundamental knowledge and careful observation, she began to understand her patient's condition in a way that transcended the information provided by diagnostic equipment. She could feel the rhythm of damaged circulation, see the subtle changes in tissue coloration that indicated improving oxygenation, and sense the complex interplay of biological systems working to heal themselves if given the proper support. When the exercise ended, all three teams had managed to stabilize their patients, though none had achieved the kind of perfect outcomes that would have been expected in a normal clinical setting. More importantly, each student had been forced to confront the limitations of their training and discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The most important lesson, Marcus told the group as they debriefed the exercise, isn't about specific techniques or alternative treatments. It's about learning to trust your fundamental knowledge when your familiar tools aren't available, and developing the confidence to make difficult decisions when there are no perfect options. He gestured to the improvised equipment and plant-based medicines that had been used throughout the exercise. Everything you use today works according to the same biological and chemical principles that govern your normal treatments. The difference is that you had to understand those principles well enough to apply them creatively, rather than simply following established protocols. Xanthilla looked at her hands, which now bore small cuts and stains from the improvised surgery she had performed. For the first time in her medical education, she felt like she truly understood what it meant to heal, not as the application of technological solutions to biological problems, but as the intelligent, determined intervention of one conscious being working to preserve the life of another. Tomorrow, Dr. Vexai announced, we will advance to more complex scenarios that will test your ability to adapt these approaches to different types of medical challenges. You will learn that Deathworld medicine is not simply about surviving difficult conditions. It is about discovering the essential nature of healing itself. As the students filed out of the transformed training facility, Their conversations carried a different quality than before. Where yesterday they had discussed the exercise with the detached curiosity of academic observers, today they spoke with the engaged intensity of people who had discovered something unexpected about their own capabilities and the fundamental nature of their chosen profession. The third day of training began with an alarm that made several students jump in genuine fear before they remembered they were in a simulation. The klaxon's harsh wail echoed through the modified training facility, which had been reconfigured overnight to represent something even more challenging than the previous day's controlled chaos. A mass casualty event, with multiple species casualties and rapidly changing environmental conditions. Real emergencies don't wait for you to finish your training, Marcus announced over the alarm, his voice cutting through the noise with the kind of calm authority that came from actual experience with genuine crises. They don't give you time to research optimal treatment protocols or consult with specialists. They happen, and you respond, or people die while you're trying to decide what to do. The training facility now resembled the aftermath of a catastrophic accident. Multiple patient androids were scattered throughout the space, each programmed to represent different species with different injury patterns and different physiological needs. Smoke machines created visibility problems, temperature controls had been adjusted to simulate the uncomfortable heat of failing life support systems, and deliberate equipment malfunctions meant that students would have to constantly adapt their approaches as familiar tools became unavailable. You have 17 patients, Marcus continued, his scarred hands gesturing to the organized chaos surrounding them. 12 different species, ranging from minor injuries to immediately life-threatening trauma. You have limited supplies, unreliable equipment, and approximately 30 minutes before environmental conditions deteriorate to the point where evacuation becomes mandatory. Dr. Vexhai observed from a raised platform that allowed her to monitor the entire exercise. She had initially been skeptical about the value of such dramatically challenging scenarios, but yesterday's results had convinced her that her students needed to be pushed far beyond their comfort zones. The improvement in their fundamental understanding of medical principles had been remarkable, even if their technical performance had been initially crude compared to their normal precision. The goal, Marcus explained, is not to save everyone. Under these conditions, that would be impossible even for the most experienced trauma team. The goal is to learn how to make rapid triage decisions that maximize the number of lives you can save with the resources you have available. You're going to discover what it means to practice medicine when every choice involves sacrifice. Zanfilla felt her compound eyes struggling to process the scene before her. The previous day's single-patient exercise had been challenging enough, but this scenario presented the kind of overwhelming complexity that made her species' harmonics shift into frequencies associated with mild panic. On Vespera, medical emergencies were handled by specialized teams with clearly defined roles and protocols. The idea of making rapid decisions about multiple patients simultaneously challenged fundamental assumptions about how medical care should be delivered. Takora's redundant heart systems were already working overtime, pumping stress biochemicals that made it difficult to think clearly. Her species' approach to medicine emphasized careful consideration and perfect execution. They had eliminated uncertainty from medical practice by ensuring that doctors never faced situations where optimal care wasn't possible. The concept of deliberately accepting imperfect outcomes in order to help more people violated core principles of Kantari medical ethics. I don't understand the logic, Takora said, her melodious voice carrying harmonics of genuine distress. If we cannot provide optimal care to all patients, surely the appropriate response is to request additional resources rather than accept substandard treatment outcomes. Marcus looked at her with the same expression of patient sadness that had become familiar over the past few days. What happens when there are no additional resources? What do you do when you're the only medical professional available, when the nearest hospital is 18 months away, and when people are dying while you're trying to figure out how to treat everyone perfectly? He gestured to the patient androids scattered throughout the training area. This scenario is based on an actual event from Kepler 442. A mining platform explosion left me with exactly this situation. Multiple species casualties, failing equipment, limited supplies, and no possibility of evacuation or additional support. I had to choose who to treat first, who could wait, and who was beyond help. Every decision meant that someone's chances of survival changed. Crex's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that indicated profound philosophical conflict. His species' medical tradition was built on the principle that all life was equally valuable and that healing was a process of restoring natural harmony rather than making utilitarian calculations about resource allocation. The idea that effective medicine might require choosing some lives over others contradicted everything he understood about the purpose of medical practice. Surely, Querex pulsed in patterns of cautious inquiry. There must be alternative approaches that don't require such choices. On Serenitia, we believe that the proper response to overwhelming need is to expand our capacity for healing rather than limit our commitment to individual patients. Marcus picked up his worn leather satchel and began removing the improvised tools and plant-based medicines that the students had become familiar with over the past 2 days. But today, he divided them into smaller portions, demonstrating the reality of limited supplies in a way that made resource scarcity tangible rather than theoretical. "That's a beautiful ideal," Marcus said. "And under normal circumstances, it's absolutely the right approach." But what happens when expansion isn't possible? What do you do when your capacity for healing is fixed by circumstances beyond your control, and the only variable you can affect is how you allocate that limited capacity? He gestured to a patient android that was programmed to represent severe trauma requiring immediate surgery. This patient needs 2 hours of intensive care to survive. During those 2 hours, 3 other patients with less severe injuries will die if they don't receive treatment. Do you save 1 life or 3? The weight of this question settled over the assembled students, like a physical presence. Most had never contemplated medical practice as a series of zero-sum choices where helping one patient meant being unable to help others. The infrastructure of galactic civilization was designed to ensure that such choices were unnecessary. Resources could always be redirected, specialists could always be consulted, and time could always be gained through technological intervention. Today's exercise will force you to make those choices, Marcus continued. You'll discover that medicine isn't always about finding the perfect solution. Sometimes it's about finding the solution that saves the most lives, even when that means accepting outcomes that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. The alarm stopped, replaced by the sound of failing machinery and the urgent beeping of patient monitoring systems. The exercise had begun, and the students found themselves thrust into a situation that challenged every assumption they had developed about how medical care should be delivered. Zenthila approached the nearest patient android and immediately realized that her normal diagnostic approach would be impossibly slow under these conditions. The patient appeared to be a Kanthari like Takora, but with radiation burns that covered most of his crystalline skin surface and internal injuries that would require complex treatment. Her training told her to begin with comprehensive scans and detailed analysis, but the sounds of distress from other patients made it clear that such thoroughness would mean neglecting other casualties. Primary assessment only, she told herself, forcing her compound eyes to focus on the most critical indicators. Airway, circulation, immediate life threats. Everything else comes later. It was harder than she had expected. Every instinct developed through years of training urged her to be thorough, to gather complete information before making treatment decisions. But the reality of the scenario, multiple patients, limited time, deteriorating conditions, forced her to make rapid judgments based on incomplete data. At the next station, Takora was experiencing her own crisis of medical philosophy. Her patient was a young Nexian with what appeared to be severe neurological trauma that would require the kind of delicate, time-intensive treatment that her species specialized in. But even as she began her assessment, she could hear Querex calling for help with a patient whose injuries were less severe but who would die within minutes without immediate intervention. "Help me!" Querex's bioluminescent patterns flashed in urgent distress frequencies. "This patient is experiencing rapid decompensation, but I cannot determine the underlying pathophysiology without proper diagnostic equipment." Takora faced a choice that violated everything she had been taught about medical responsibility. Her Nexian patient needed her expertise and would likely die without her specialized care. But Querex's patient could potentially be saved by anyone with basic trauma training. Did she continue with the complex case that matched her qualifications, or abandon her specialty to help with a simpler problem that was more immediately urgent? Marcus watched from across the training area as his students struggled with these fundamental questions. He remembered his own first experience with mass casualty triage during his medical residency on Earth, and how the theoretical knowledge had felt completely inadequate when faced with the reality of having to choose between patients. But Earth's medical training included preparation for such scenarios, because humans had learned through bitter experience that civilization was fragile and resources were always limited. Most galactic species had never needed to learn those lessons. Their civilizations were old, stable, and sophisticated enough to provide abundant resources for medical care. The concept of triage was academic to them, something studied in historical context rather than practiced as a necessary skill. "The hardest part," Marcus called out to the struggling students, "isn't the technical aspects of treatment. It's learning to accept that you can't save everyone and focusing your energy on the patients you can help rather than agonizing over the ones you can't." Vorthak, the crystalline Nexian student, was discovering this lesson firsthand. He had found a patient whose bioenergetic patterns indicated the kind of deep systemic trauma that his species excelled at treating, but providing that treatment would require hours of intensive focus. Around him, other patients were presenting simpler problems that could be addressed quickly, freeing him up to help more people overall. The mathematics are clear. He resonated at frequencies indicating reluctant acceptance. I can save one patient through specialized intervention, or I can save 4 patients through rapid basic care. But everything in my training emphasizes the importance of providing optimal treatment rather than merely adequate treatment. His dilemma was interrupted by an equipment failure that simulated the loss of power to his bioenergetic healing apparatus. Suddenly, his choice was simplified. He could no longer provide the specialized treatment his preferred patient needed, so he had to focus on what was actually possible, rather than what would be ideal. As the exercise progressed, students found themselves forced to adapt in ways that challenged their fundamental understanding of medical practice. Equipment failures required creative improvisation. Supply shortages forced them to ration treatments they had always considered unlimited. Time pressure eliminated the luxury of careful consideration that they had been taught was essential for good medicine. But something remarkable began to happen. Stripped of their familiar tools and forced to rely on fundamental knowledge and rapid decision-making, the students began to demonstrate capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Zent, the leader, discovered she could assess patient condition far more rapidly than she had ever thought possible. Takora learned to delegate complex treatments to less specialized colleagues, while she focused on cases that specifically required her expertise. Querix found that his intuitive understanding of biological harmony could guide effective treatment decisions even without detailed diagnostic data. Marcus watched with growing satisfaction as his students transformed from careful, precise medical technicians into adaptive problem solvers capable of functioning under impossible conditions. The change wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. They were learning to think of medicine as an active struggle against time and circumstance rather than a carefully controlled application of established procedures. Environmental warning, announced Dr. Vexay from her observation platform. Temperature rising beyond safe parameters for extended exposure. Evacuation will be mandatory in 10 minutes. This added another layer of complexity to the scenario. Students now had to balance their commitment to their patients against their own safety and make decisions about which patients could be moved quickly and which treatments could be interrupted without causing additional harm. This happened twice on Kepler 442c, Marcus explained as his students struggled with these new constraints. Environmental changes that forced us to move patients before treatment was complete. You learn to stabilize people for transport rather than treating them to full recovery. You learn to continue medical care under conditions that would be considered impossible in any normal medical facility. Xanthilla found herself working with Takora and Vortak to prepare their most critical patients for emergency evacuation. The process required them to coordinate their different medical specialties in ways they had never attempted before, creating hybrid treatment approaches that combined Vesperan precision, Canthari sophistication, and Nexian bioenergetic techniques. The key, Takora realized as she worked to stabilize a patient for transport, is not to abandon our specialized knowledge, but to apply it more flexibly. My species' techniques for precise cellular repair can be adapted to provide rapid stabilization if I focus on immediate life preservation rather than perfect healing. Querix was having similar realizations about the adaptability of his own medical tradition. Biological harmony principles can guide rapid triage decisions, he pulsed in patterns of growing understanding. If I focus on identifying which patients' natural healing processes can be supported effectively with available resources, rather than trying to achieve perfect balance for all patients, I can help more people overall. As the evacuation alarm began sounding, students worked frantically to complete critical treatments and prepare patients for transport. But instead of the panic that might have been expected, there was a sense of focused intensity. They had learned to function under pressure and were discovering that extreme conditions could bring out capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The exercise ended with all students having successfully managed the evacuation of their patients, though not all simulated outcomes had been optimal. Several patient androids had been programmed to die during the scenario, forcing students to confront the reality that sometimes their best efforts would not be sufficient. Failure is part of medicine, Marcus told the group during their debriefing session, not because you're not good enough or because you didn't try hard enough, but because medicine is practiced at the intersection of human knowledge and natural law. And there are always cases where knowledge and technique aren't sufficient to overcome the fundamental limitations of biology and physics. He gestured to his scarred hands. which bore the marks of countless improvised procedures and desperate attempts to save lives under impossible conditions. These scars don't represent mistakes. They represent the price of refusing to give up when conventional approaches failed. Every mark is from learning something new about what's possible when everything that should work doesn't. And you have to find another way. Xanthilla looked at her own hands, which now bore small cuts and stains from the improvised medical procedures she had performed over the past 3 days. For the first time in her medical education, she felt like she truly understood the difference between practicing medicine and simply applying medical knowledge. The difference lay not in the sophistication of available tools, but in the willingness to push beyond established boundaries when circumstances demanded it. "Tomorrow," Dr. Vexhai announced, "we will explore the psychological aspects of Deathworld medicine. You will learn that the most important tool a doctor possesses is not technological, but mental, the ability to maintain hope and determination when everything seems hopeless." As students left the training facility, their conversations carried the weight of new understanding. They had discovered that medicine was not simply a matter of applying established protocols to familiar problems, but a dynamic process of adaptation and innovation in the face of constantly changing challenges. More importantly, they had learned that their own capabilities extended far beyond what their comfortable, predictable training environments had ever revealed. The fourth day began differently. Instead of alarms and simulated chaos, the training facility had been configured to look almost normal, clean, well-lit, with properly functioning equipment and organized supplies. But the students had learned enough over the past 3 days to recognize that this apparent normalcy was probably deceptive. Marcus stood at the center of the room. But today, he wasn't holding his worn leather satchel or demonstrating improvised tools. Instead, he simply stood quietly, his scarred hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the students to settle into position. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before he finally spoke. "The hardest part of practicing medicine under impossible conditions," Marcus began, "isn't learning new techniques or improvising with limited resources. It's maintaining your sanity when everything around you suggests that what you're trying to do is pointless." He gestured to the normal-looking training facility around them. "Today's exercise is different. You'll have access to proper equipment, adequate supplies, and stable environmental conditions. But you'll be treating patients who probably can't be saved, under circumstances that would make most medical professionals conclude that continued effort is futile." Dr. Vexhai observed from her usual position, but her 4 eyes showed the kind of concerned attention that suggested she found this particular lesson more troubling than the previous day's technical challenges. Her species had developed sophisticated medical technology partly to avoid the psychological trauma that came from helplessness in the face of suffering. The idea that doctors might need to function effectively while accepting probable failure challenged fundamental assumptions about the emotional requirements of medical practice. "On Kepler, 442c, Marcus continued, I lost patience. Not because I didn't know how to treat their conditions, not because I lacked the necessary resources, but because some injuries and illnesses are simply beyond what medicine can address, even under perfect conditions. The question becomes, how do you continue trying to save other people after you've watched someone die despite your best efforts?" Xanthilla felt her compound eyes shifting into patterns associated with deep unease. Her species' medical training included extensive psychological preparation, but it focused on maintaining composure during complex procedures rather than coping with failure. The Vesperan approach to medicine emphasized precision and predictability. They had developed techniques so refined that treatment failure was extremely rare. The concept of routinely facing medical situations where optimal care would still result in patient death was alien to her entire conceptual framework. "Surely," Xanthilla said, her harmonic voice carrying undertones of polite confusion, "proper preparation and adequate resources would minimize such scenarios. If treatment failure is predictable, wouldn't the appropriate response be to improve treatment capabilities rather than prepare psychologically for failure?" Marcus smiled, but it was the kind of expression that conveyed more sadness than warmth. "That's exactly what I thought when I first qualified as a doctor. I believed that medicine was about solving problems, and that any patient death represented either inadequate knowledge or insufficient resources. I was convinced that the right training and the right equipment could overcome any medical challenge." He walked to a nearby table and picked up what appeared to be a standard medical scanner, the kind of precision diagnostic tool that every student was familiar with. This scanner can detect cellular damage at the quantum level, analyze genetic expression patterns in real time, and predict physiological responses with 97% accuracy. It represents hundreds of years of technological advancement and costs more than most planets spend on their entire medical infrastructure. Marcus set the scanner down and looked directly at Xanthelia. On Kepler 442c, I used a scanner just like this one to diagnose a young mining engineer with radiation poisoning from exotic particles that had been created when the planet's magnetic field interacted with solar flare activity. The scanner gave me perfect information about exactly how his cells were being damaged, precisely which biological processes were failing, and an accurate prediction of how long he had to live. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Every student in the room understood the implications. Perfect diagnostic information had been useless because the condition itself was beyond current medical knowledge. What happens? Marcus asked quietly. When your equipment works perfectly, your diagnosis is accurate, and your patient dies anyway because the universe contains problems that medical science hasn't solved yet. Takora's redundant heart systems began pumping stress biochemicals as she contemplated this question. Her species had achieved medical mastery partly by ensuring that they never encountered unsolvable problems. They had carefully controlled their environment and their biology to eliminate medical uncertainty. The idea that doctors might regularly face conditions beyond their ability to treat challenged core assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and healing. Perhaps, Takora suggested, her melodious voice carrying harmonics of cautious hope, the appropriate response would be to expand medical research to address previously unsolvable conditions. Surely any problem that appears insurmountable is simply a problem that requires additional study? Marcus nodded approvingly.
That's absolutely the right long-term approach.
Every unsolvable problem today becomes tomorrow's routine treatment if enough brilliant people work on it long enough. But what do you do while you're waiting for those breakthroughs? What happens to the patients who need help now, before the research is complete? He gestured to several patient androids that had been positioned throughout the training facility. Unlike the previous day's scenarios, these patients weren't programmed to present the kind of chaotic, traumatic injuries that could be addressed through improvisation and determination. Instead, they represented the kinds of progressive, degenerative conditions that could be diagnosed perfectly but couldn't be cured with any known treatment. Today's exercise involves terminal cases, Marcus explained. Patients whose conditions you can understand completely but can't cure. Your job isn't to save them. That's impossible with current medical knowledge. Your job is to help them while accepting that your help won't be enough to prevent the ultimate outcome. Krex's bioluminescent pattern shifted to colors that indicated profound philosophical distress. His species' medical tradition was built on the principle that all biological problems had biological solutions if approached with sufficient understanding and patience. The concept of deliberately treating patients who couldn't be saved violated everything he understood about the purpose of medical practice. I do not understand the logic of this exercise. Querex pulsed in patterns of polite confusion. If the patients cannot be saved, and if we know that our interventions will not alter the ultimate outcome, what is the educational value of practicing futile medicine? Marcus looked at Querex with an expression that conveyed both understanding and profound compassion. That's exactly the question I asked my supervisor after my first terminal patient died, despite everything I tried to do for him. I couldn't understand why we had spent resources on treatments that we knew wouldn't work, why we had given the family hope when the outcome was predetermined, why we had put everyone through the emotional trauma of fighting a battle we couldn't win. He paused, and for a moment his scarred hands moved unconsciously to touch the leather satchel that had become his constant companion. My supervisor told me something that I didn't understand until much later. Medicine isn't just about preventing death, it's about affirming life. Sometimes that means curing diseases and healing injuries, but sometimes it means helping someone live as well as possible for whatever time they have left, and helping their families cope with loss, and demonstrating that their life has value even when it's ending. The weight of this explanation settled over the students like a revelation. Most had been trained to think of medicine as a technical challenge, problems to be solved through the application of knowledge and skill. The idea that medical practice might sometimes involve accepting defeat while continuing to fight anyway challenged their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a doctor. The patients in today's exercise, Marcus continued, are programmed to respond to supportive care. They won't get better, but they can be made more comfortable. They can be given dignity. Their families can be helped to understand what's happening and to say goodbye properly. These are medical interventions just as much as surgery or pharmaceutical treatment. Dr. Vexai stepped forward from her observation position. This particular aspect of human medical practice has been difficult for the Galactic Medical Council to understand, she admitted. Most species medical traditions focus on curative intervention. The human emphasis on palliative care and emotional support for terminal patients represents a significantly different philosophical approach. Marcus nodded. Different, but not necessarily better or worse. It's just that humans developed medicine on a world where death was a constant presence, where resources were always limited, and where doctors regularly faced patients they couldn't save.
We had to learn to find meaning in medical practice even when we couldn't prevent suffering or death.
He gestured to the patient androids waiting throughout the facility.
You'll work in the same teams as yesterday, but today your success won't be measured by whether your patients survive. It will be measured by whether you can maintain your commitment to caring for them even when you know your care won't be enough. Xanthilla approached her assigned patient, an android programmed to represent an elderly Canthari with a degenerative neurological condition that had been carefully designed to be completely incurable with any known medical intervention. The android's responses were sophisticated enough to simulate the psychological complexity of someone facing their own mortality while trying to maintain dignity and connection with their family. Her first instinct was to begin comprehensive scans and treatment planning, but the diagnostic data quickly confirmed what Marcus had told them. The condition was progressive, terminal, and beyond current medical knowledge. Every intervention she could contemplate would, at best, delay the inevitable by small amounts while potentially causing additional suffering. "This is impossible," she said to her teammates, to Cora and Vortak. "Everything in my training tells me to identify the problem and solve it, but this problem has no solution. How do we practice medicine when medicine can't accomplish its fundamental purpose?" Takora was struggling with similar philosophical challenges. Her species' medical tradition emphasized perfect outcomes achieved through careful technique and advanced technology. The idea of deliberately providing care that wouldn't achieve perfect outcomes, or even good outcomes, challenged everything she understood about medical responsibility. Perhaps, Takora suggested, the appropriate response is to focus on pain management and comfort measures rather than curative treatment. If we cannot heal the underlying condition, we might at least minimize its impact on quality of life. Vortak's crystalline form resonated with frequencies that indicated deep contemplation. The bioenergetic patterns suggest that this patient's essential life force is gradually diminishing in a way that cannot be restored through any known intervention. But there might be ways to help the remaining life energy function more efficiently, to provide moments of clarity and comfort, even within the context of overall decline. As they worked with their terminal patient, the students gradually discovered that medicine under these circumstances required completely different skills than what they had been trained for. Instead of focusing on biological processes and treatment outcomes, they found themselves learning to listen to their patients' concerns, to provide emotional support to frightened family members, and to maintain hope without offering false promises about recovery. Marcus moved between the teams, offering guidance that was more philosophical than technical. "The goal isn't to pretend that everything will be fine," he told one struggling group. "The goal is to help your patient feel that their life has meaning and dignity even as it's ending." Sometimes the most powerful medical intervention is simply being present with someone during their darkest moment. At another workstation, Querex was discovering that his species' emphasis on biological harmony could be adapted to provide comfort even when cure was impossible. His patient, an android representing a young Vesperan with a genetic condition that caused progressive organ failure, was responding to bioenergetic treatments that couldn't halt the disease progression but could ease some of the associated discomfort. "I begin to understand," Crex pulsed in patterns of reluctant revelation. "The harmony we seek is not always the harmony of perfect health. Sometimes it is the harmony of acceptance, of finding peace within circumstances that cannot be changed. This is also a form of healing, though not the form I was trained to recognize." The most challenging aspect of the exercise proved to be the families. The patient androids were programmed to interact with simulated family members who were struggling to understand their loved one's condition, to cope with the reality of impending loss, and to make difficult decisions about end-of-life care. The students found themselves serving not just as medical professionals but as counselors, educators, and sources of emotional support for people facing circumstances they had never prepared for. "This is beyond my training," admitted a student from a species that had eliminated family structures in favor of collective child rearing. "I understand the biological aspects of the patient's condition, but I do not know how to help these family members process their emotional responses. Their grief appears to be interfering with rational decision-making about care options." Marcus sat down with the struggling student, his expression patient and understanding. "Grief isn't a malfunction to be corrected," he explained. "It's a natural response to loss. And learning to work with it, rather than against it, is part of medical practice when you're dealing with terminal patients. The family's emotions aren't interfering with good medical decisions, they're part of the context that determines what good medical decisions look like. As the day progressed, students found themselves confronting questions that had never appeared in any of their textbooks. How do you maintain professional composure while watching someone die despite your best efforts? How do you provide honest information about prognosis without destroying all hope? How do you help families make peace with decisions that feel like giving up but are actually the most compassionate choices available? The hardest part of Kepler. 442C, Marcus told the group during a break in the exercise, wasn't the technical challenges or the resource limitations or even the physical danger. It was watching people I cared about suffer and die while knowing that all my knowledge and skill weren't enough to save them. It was learning to find meaning in medicine even when medicine couldn't provide the outcomes I wanted to achieve. He gestured to his scarred hands, which bore marks not just from improvised surgery, but from the psychological strain of practicing medicine under impossible conditions. These scars aren't just from physical trauma. Some of them are from the emotional cost of refusing to give up on patients, even when logic suggested that continued effort was pointless. But I learned that giving up would have been worse than failing, because giving up would have meant abandoning the people who needed whatever help I could provide, even if that help wasn't enough. Xanthila looked at her own hands, which now bore the marks of 4 days of practicing medicine under conditions that challenged everything she thought she knew about healing. But more than the physical changes, she was aware of psychological changes. A growing understanding that medicine was about more than technical competence, that healing involved more than curing, and that sometimes the most important thing a doctor could do was simply refuse to abandon a patient, even when hope seemed futile. The exercise concluded with each team having successfully provided palliative care to their terminal patients, though none had been able to prevent the inevitable outcomes. But instead of feeling defeated, the students found themselves experiencing something unexpected, a sense of meaningful accomplishment that had nothing to do with achieving perfect medical results. Tomorrow, Dr. Vexhai announced, will be your final exercise. You will integrate everything you have learned about Deathworld medicine into a comprehensive scenario that will test not just your technical skills, but your ability to maintain your commitment to healing under the most challenging possible circumstances. As students left the training facility, their conversations carried a different quality than on previous days. They spoke not just about medical techniques and treatment protocols, but about the deeper meaning of choosing medicine as a profession and the responsibility that came with dedicating one's life to healing others, even when healing wasn't always possible.